on. So mic is hot. Okay. So we've got 10 minutes after, so I will go ahead and kick this off. The title here, I was trying to do a little bit of work with the musical theme. I have much more musical desire than I do musical talent, I'm afraid. So it didn't quite work. So another way maybe to look at this is an alternate title. Let's have some fun with NIST 800-63. Now that may seem a little bit of a strange subject to talk about having fun with, and we're talking about here particularly about digital identity and what does that mean in the context of security. And so I think it actually is possible to have fun with policy and with some NIST documents. There's actually some very interesting things about it that I will get into in a few minutes. So this is where I say, so you think I'm weird to have some interest in this subject? That's fine. You'll be sure about that fairly quickly. A few disclaimers to get started with. I am not your CISO, I am not an auditor, and I am not a lawyer. I will talk about some products. Those are examples, not endorsements. NIST 863 Revision 3 is over 200 pages. I can fly through a little bit. I have spent a good chunk of the last year studying this. There's a lot of interesting fun in there, but we're really only going to be hitting some highlights of it. As an outline, I want to talk about the background of the whole family of NIST 800-63 and the concept of digital identity as a general comment. We'll talk about some things in Revision 2. That was what was out until relatively recently. We will then move into Revision 3 and some very important changes that came in with Revision 3 and some new stuff. Now let me roll back a little bit. 2004 was a very interesting year. As one interesting reference, that was the year after my oldest child graduated from high school. I've been in this business for a while, or in a business. Windows XP was 3 years old. We were at Mac OS 10.3 Panther. Google had its IPO. A Pentium 4 was a fast computer. And we got the first version of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST Special Publication 863, Electronic Authentication Guideline. And that's interesting here too, because I will talk about this in the context of what NIST says. These are intended as guidelines. I do work in the federal government space. I work for Oak Ridge National Laboratory as an enterprise architect. And it's a little bit interesting because sometimes what NIST put out as guidelines, some of my regulators say it's gospel. And that can be a little bit of a challenge. There have been some intervening revisions. So the first version was in 2004, a revision in 2004 a little bit later. We had April 2006, so not too much after that, a couple years, version 1.02. The so-called /1 revision, about 5 years later, that was fairly quickly updated to revision 2 in 2013, and then a significant gap here of about 4 years before they came out with revision 3. Revision 3 was done with a very interesting process. It was done in a very open way. It was done through GitHub and issues and comments. It was actually published through GitHub pages. And this is really also important too, because part of what I've been able to do is to read through the comments and the responses to help understand some of the thinking for what was in Rev 3. So let's take a half step back. Now that said, electronic authentication guidelines, I'm actually going to talk about digital identity because that's actually what's the title now in Revision 3. I think this is an interesting comment. Digital identity, online persona of a subject, a single definition is widely debated internationally. Digital identity is a hard topic. Both of these are quotes directly from the current revision of this particular document. Like any computer person, I want a different definition, so I go to Wikipedia. This is their definition. Information on an entity used by a computer system to represent somebody external. All of this comes back to this whole metaphor on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog. This was originally done in 1993 by Peter Steiner in the New York Magazine. Very prescient for many of the things that were going to come on down the pike. But it leads to a very important question as somebody running an information system. How confident do I need to be about which particular dog is using my system? And of course the answer is, it depends. This "it depends" translates into revision 2 in something that they called a level of assurance, LOA, which is constantly a term that's being used. And in specific, Rev 2 defined 4 levels of assurance. Level 1 was that no identity proofing was required, some weak passwords were fine, and there are almost no security requirements. And so you wind up with things like password and monkey as being relatively common sorts of things at revision, at level 1 assurance. Level 2, some identity proofing is required, some restrictions on passwords, so they had to be strong passwords or some other single factor, and there are some security requirements. Actually, level 2 does require salting and hashing, for example, that I will get into. And you get into some of these more complicated passwords. The second one is actually randomly generated. The first one is one of these things that is talked about in some of the NIST publications for those who are students of history when in the course of human events. 1776. So these sort of passphrase kinds of things that come out of this. No, I do not use either one of these passwords. You also get something like Google Authenticator. This is also a single-factor authentication when it's used by itself. This is one of the things that's also possible at Rev 2, or at level 2. At level of assurance 3, we get strong identity proofing with verification. LOA 3 requires multi-factor authentication and has some very stringent security requirements. So you get something like a secure ID with a PIN, multi-factor, something you have, something you know. You get a password with the SMS loop. LOA 4 used very strong in-person, had a very hard requirement. You cannot do a remote registration to give somebody a credential at LOA 4. That had to be an in-person registration. Hardware-based multi-factor authentication that is validated at FIPS 140-2, level 2, and some very strong security requirements. So you get the PIV, the positive identity verification. So a smart card that's a hardware-based, has a certificate, a PIN on it. I've shown here another couple of examples of some hardware-based one-time password token generators, things that have a PIN that has to go into that particular device. Those are the things that are required, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Comment here, and NIST is very clear on this point, and it's interesting because I had an argument about this with actually, I think, a fairly well-respected company that deals with password managers. And they were very proud of their multi-factor authentication because they had 2 passwords. I'm sorry, password 1 plus password 2 is not multi-factor. Those are 2 things that you know. Multi-factor is a combination of something you know, something you have, something you are. Again, reminder on all of that. But what kind of authenticators are permitted in 863? They define these types, and I'm going to walk through them. So the first type that they define is a memorized secret. Well, this is what we think of commonly. Something you know, it's a password, whether it's a fairly simple password, or a much more complicated password, or even potentially the PIN that gets used with something else. And there are some requirements about what kinds of things are permitted, particularly in level 2. They do require salting and hashing, particularly at revision 2. That's part of the security requirements. Pre-registered knowledge, again, talking about this in the context of authentication, as again, something you know, and this is your standard example of, for example, the security questions that have become fairly popular relatively recently? What was your first thought? What's your favorite teacher's name? Now, this is an interesting example. This is a pre-registered knowledge, but in NIST language, this is knowledge that should only be shared between the verifier and the subject. In this case, this is something that the IRS has used because, at least in theory, you and the IRS are the only ones who know what your adjusted gross income was last year. So that's an example of a very private pre-registered knowledge question. My employer, when they're doing some, needing to do some authentication on the phone, might ask somebody, what was your report to work date? Now, it can be discovered, but that's, again, something that should be relatively private. Because I work for the federal government, and I happen to have a security clearance, OPM. So yeah, I've done all of the credit freeze stuff. And so this is, again, a pre-registered knowledge kind of authentication. So when I go back to one of the credit bureaus, they will ask me for the PIN that they gave me when I froze my credit. Again, that's an example of a pre-registered knowledge form of a verifier. Lookup secrets, I don't see these very often. Steve Gibson, love him or hate him, has this perfect paper passwords. So this is an example of a lookup secret. It's not the same sort of thing as a knowledge-based verifier because these are used once, but you would look it up on a particular chart. Certain kinds of systems, they're going to give you these codes that you can use if you've lost your phone or something else along those lines. That's another example of a lookup secret. Out-of-band token. The most common is what I call the SMS loop. You're going to register that phone number. They're going to send you this confirmation code. Many people will think about this as a one-time password. It's not. I'm going to draw a distinction. What's a one-time password verifier versus an out-of-band token? But the key point is this is something that the verifier is sending the user through something other than the channel that you're talking with them with. So it's coming through an SMS channel. It's coming through an email. One of the systems that I use to log into the administrative panel, I get something through the email. And 800-63 will say a little bit about that. This is also an out-of-band for those of you who have used Duo. Now, in this case, it's not sending me a number that I have to put into the web page, but it's asking me to click that button on my phone to confirm what needs to happen. And there's some crypto that happens behind the scenes. Now, I mentioned that one-time password is not really what NIST talks about as a one-time password token generator, being an example of something you have. So the Google Authenticator, more specifically, this is TOTP, time-based one-time password. The key piece here, the way NIST looks at this, these are all things that are based out of symmetric encryption. There is a symmetric encryption key or a keyed hash, that secret that has to be known by both the client, whatever is the authentication tool, and the verifier. They both have to have a copy of the same thing. It's a symmetric password. So this is an example of a software-based one-time password. These are all examples of a hardware-based one-time password. Now, the YubiKey is particularly interesting because that is something that can function and normally does if you're using this with the FIDO Alliance approach. That's as a one-time password. YubiKey can also be the next kind of thing, a cryptographic token validator. And then those two are examples of multi-factor one-time password. Again, all of them are the same sort of thing. There is either the same key that's used to key a hash, a key that's used for symmetric encryption, which makes it all the more confusing because then there's this next type of authentication, which is a cryptographic token validator. The difference here, and again, this is something you have, one-time password token generators are based on a symmetric encryption. Cryptographic are based on an asymmetric encryption. And NIST really spent a lot of time and really I thought has a fascination with cryptographic token because the key point is there's a private key that only the subject has. You don't have to share the information. The verifier does not have to hold sensitive information for the cryptographic token generator. And for the Linux geeks among us, an SSH key is probably one of the most common examples of this. A digital certificate is another example, and I'm going to talk a lot. There's some interesting things that you can do. You can have a multi-factor authenticator. If you've used Windows Hello on the consumer grade or on the consumer side of things, you're actually using a cryptographic token validator. It's putting a certificate in the trusted platform module on that Windows device. These are also examples of these. Again, the YubiKey in certificate mode, that smart card that has the certificate in it, typically with a PIN being necessary to unlock it. The other happens to be a SafeNet e-token. Same kind of thing. It's a hardware-based device that has a certificate on it. And the key question for this, as far as some of the NIST documents are concerned, is whether or not that hardware device has been validated, is certified with FIPS 140-2. Have they gone through this fairly rigorous process, which is kind of expensive? Now, my little caveat on that, we had a problem relatively recently known as the ROCA vulnerability. And the consequence of that was that if you had a public key, private key that was generated on a system that was vulnerable to ROCA, that was actually a very easily factorizable certificate, and it was easy to tell that. Turns out many of the TPMs that were ROCA vulnerable were also FIPS validated. So this is something that needs to be taken as an indicator, but it's hardly a final key. A little bit of a digression here. I've mentioned certificates, particularly these. It is actually possible to use a certificate as an SSH key. And for those that are interested, the slides will be available. I'll give you a link later if you want these incantations. But basically, I can take that public certificate that I got off of my smart card, do a little bit of some SSH keygen work with it to turn it into that particular format. I can then take and put that SSH key into an LDAP and configure my SSHD environment to point at that LDAP. And then use the PKCS11s. So I'm actually using a very, very hardened device, a smart card with a digital certificate as my means to be able to SSH into a server. And in my professional world, when I'm going into a server with a privileged account, this is exactly what I do to provide a fairly high level of assurance. And then if you're on Windows, the Secure CRT is also able to read from a smart card. And then there are both of the links to that. There's another thing where 863 Rev 2 was showing some signs of age. So I mentioned this as an out-of-band. And we talked about one example where there was an out-of-band authenticator. I got my little 6-digit number through an SMS loop or through an email. But I didn't really have a chance to communicate back to the verifier. You know, maybe I could have called somebody, and in some cases you actually do now see that SMS that says, if you didn't send this, reply back, and you can get a signal back in. But Duo built this in, and it's an interesting risk reduction, and I'm going to follow up on this point, but the user can actually say, no, that wasn't me. And this is a risk reduction that Rev 2 doesn't really anticipate, because this is an example of potentially being an LOA3 authentication, but it has some different risk profiles than other forms of out-of-band authenticators. I've pointed out again these kinds of multi-factor devices, and again just reinforcing that point that NIST makes a number of times. Something can be multi-factor, so that PIN plus this is an example of something that you know and something you have. The PIV card, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is another example of that. You've actually got an interesting example of, for example, I have This happens to be a screenshot of the RSA Secure ID app. So this is actually all three things if it's properly configured. So you have something that you are, that's the biometric to unlock the device, something you know, which is the PIN, and something that you have, which is the one-time password token generator. And again, one of the challenges here is to understand your environment in terms of looking at this from a policy perspective. If it's my employer letting me use my phone, they don't know whether I have the biometrics turned on or not, and NIST does talk about this. So again, coming back to this in revision 2, and where this matters was that the federal government, in fact, in part because of that OPM breach that I mentioned, really made a hard push and said everybody really needs to go specifically to PIV, but in particular to this level of assurance 4. What does it take to get there? Now, I mentioned these hardware-based one-time password, like one of the old forms of the Secure ID, which, by the way, you can't buy anymore. It's no longer really on the market. So it really amounted to being able to do some form of a smart card, a certificate-based authentication, whether in this card format or in this. And it's kind of interesting, because if you take one of these little puppies apart, you actually find that little gold piece is buried in there. It's exactly the same format. It's just this is giving it a different USB. I mentioned that you can do the certificate on the YubiKey, but they have not yet actually gotten it FIPS validated. So even though it's a similar strength thing, that is only level 3 because of this whole certification question, and that as a one-time password is only level 3. So one of the challenges from my perspective is that there was really only one way under Rev 2 to get to this highest level of assurance. It required one of these sorts of things and some very strong identity proofing. We'll talk about that in the context of Rev 3 here in a few minutes. Do another digression. There was a lot of push across the federal government, and if you work with the government or involved directly with that, was this HSPD 12, Homeland Presidential Security Directive number 12, as in 2012. So there is some confusion around here because there's another document. There are a lot more requirements on this than there really are to get to LOA 4. And then one more digression that I want to comment on. And this is, again, one of the challenges in talking with some of the folks at NIST, and we talk about this in security. There are two kinds of problems when I'm looking at authentication. This is the one that we're most concerned about. It has some fairly profound consequences. A type 1 error, also known as a false positive, which is to say a bad person is able to impersonate somebody. That's what most of that document talks about. This is most of what we think about when we're thinking about security. But the role that I sit in, I'm worried about security, but I'm also worried about operations. And so I also have to be concerned about a type 2 error, otherwise known as a false negative. Like my lab director can't log into his laptop. That can be a little bit of a problem. And foreshadowing a little bit, Rev 3 really, I think, starts to take some of these things into account. The final point that I want to make, and this was a lot of conversation that I've had with various people in the federal government. There is this perspective. 4 is a bigger number than 3. Therefore, level of assurance 4 is always better than level of assurance 3. And I think there's this view that when I look at cost as a function of risk, as a regulator, I have level of assurance 1 and level of assurance 2. Yeah, okay, that's maybe a little bit more expensive, but it's always less risk than level 1. Level 3, again, I'm going to spend a little bit more money, but I'm always going to reduce risk. Level 4, same concept. My perspective on that is a little bit different. Sure, we have a level of assurance 1, but there's some overlap in risk. Level 2 is almost always going to be more expensive, but not necessarily. We start moving up into level 3, And yeah, I've got more expensive, but I've got this range of risk here depending on what are my attack vectors, what are the problems that I'm trying to deal with. And level 4, again, there's not always that much difference between what can happen with a level 3 versus a level 4, but it's almost always quite a bit more expensive. And so this is one of those trade-offs. What is the right level of assurance for a particular system? So this is the summary of those level of 4s, but there's an interesting problem here. Notice that the identity assurance level is mixed in with the authentication assurance level. And that's exactly one of the things that gets dealt with in Revision 3, which is the new NIST Digital Identity Guidelines. I'm actually very much a fan of what they've done. This is a fantastic piece of work. But it's actually 4 documents. The first is that base document, 800-63-3. There is an Appendix A. This talks about identity assurance level. And so this is really trying to deal with who is it that we're talking about? Who is the user? Who is the subject? Part B deals with the authentication assurance. How confident am I that it's the same person that it was before? And then Part C deals with something called federation assurance level, which is dealing with authenticating with a Google credential, for example, to somebody else. How confident am I in a third-party interaction to say, this is the same person? And so you have this split that in Rev 2 we had 4 levels of assurance. In Rev 3, I only have 3 levels of assurance, but it's split into this identity assurance level, authentication assurance level, and possibly a federation assurance level. So again, maybe I'm worried a lot about that LOA 4 in Rev 2. That almost always is going to translate to an identity assurance level 3 and an authentication assurance level 3. But there's some interesting examples. So in my day job, one of the things we had to consider that as an LOA 3 authenticator. What does that look like in Rev 3? It could be an IAL 2, AAL 2, and a lot of them are. But actually in this particular case, that LOA 3 translated to an IAL and an AAL of 3. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping, and I'm going to dig into that. And there also are some things that are possible with the new guidelines that weren't before. So they talk about an example of perhaps doing a medical health study. You want a very high authentication assurance level. You want that high degree of confidence that the person is the same one yesterday as today as tomorrow, but you may not actually know who that person is. So you may have a low identity assurance level. So there's no correspondence between those. And so let me dig in for a minute and talk about this identity assurance level. So at IAL 1, no identity proofing is required. The user has said who they are. All of these attributes are self-asserted. In level 2, there is some evidence of that real-world identity and good verification of who that person is. And then at level 3, there's some very, very strong identity proofing in person, or this new concept I'll talk a bit about, supervised remote. So identity assurance in this world is composed of 3 components. The first of which is what they call resolution. I'm trying to identify which person we're talking about. Now, as it so happens, there is an individual who has the same first name as I do, the same last name as I do, the same middle initial as I do, and the same date of birth. Now, that gentleman is obviously not the same as me, because at the immediate moment that gentleman is in the Illinois State Penitentiary doing hard time for carjacking. So resolution is which Bruce Wilson are we talking about? Validation is to verify that that identity actually exists and that there's some authenticity of evidence. The driver's license that I presented was actually issued by the state of Tennessee, for example. And then verification is, for example, the biometrics, that the picture on my driver's license actually matches who I am. So all of this is rolled up in identity assurance. And this is a nice clean separation between this and the authentication piece. So Rev 3 introduces much more clearly this concept of trusted referee proofing. That's allowed at level 2. It's described in that particular section. Key points being you have to identity proof that referee at the same level, but it's also allowing for some interesting things. I can rely on a parent that has been identity proofed at level 2 to vouch for a child and not have to get into a whole bunch of COPA issues, for example. I can use notary publics for identity proofing at this. It's a huge change. Rev 2 also brings in a concept of this supervised remote. In Rev 2, in the old guidelines, the only way I could get to that highest end is I had to physically meet with the person. Rev 3 recognizes that we're in a somewhat different world, and there are ways to be able to do this. So this is actually allowed even at level 3. That's the section that talks about it. Now, there are some requirements. This is not just, simply fire up a Skype or a whatever have you with somebody else. There's some requirements that all of the actions of that remote subject are visible. So it actually requires some things like some wide field cameras and such. It requires some integrated equipment for collecting evidence, and then a mutually authenticated protected channel, meaning we've identified, we've agreed what's the client certificate, what's the server certificate, and so forth. But the key point is this is actually possible in a way that was not previously. Some of the other things, so I mentioned knowledge-based verification previously, so this is some of these typical examples. What address did you live at? 2002. These can be used for resolution, but they may not be used for validation or verification. So this is, I think, an important thing. The industries in general had gone into these things about, asking these questions is a means of identity proofing. In fact, I just went through one of these relatively recently, although I'm not sure where. But NIST recognizes that almost all of that information that people keep asking is available either publicly or available on the black market trivially. So that's why they've said you cannot use this. So things move slowly, but I'm hopeful that these things will go away. Again, classic example of trying to use this for authentication was the Sarah Palin issue. So what high school do we think Sarah Palin graduated from? There's only one high school in Wasilia. So key point, really, the whole knowledge-based verification really goes away. The one exception is that case where during identity proofing, I gave you a secret. We can trust that. That's something we can work with. Anything beyond that, no, we can't do that. So sliding from identity to authentication, again, we have these 3 levels. Level 1 is a single-factor authentication, so we have some assurance that it's the same person yesterday as today, and all of the passwords get lumped into that category. And Rev 3 has some interesting things to say about passwords that we will get into in a minute. Level 2 requires multi-factor authentication and what they term approved cryptographic functions, which means you're using crypto that NIST says is current. We haven't really looked at how you've done your crypto, but you've asserted that you're using modern cryptographic methods. And then level 3 requires MFA with some validated hardware, and it's a very high degree of confidence. So same kinds of authenticators, but that pre-registered knowledge goes away. And we have a lot more ways to get to that high level. So again, in Rev 2, the only way to get to that top level was that smart card, that hardware-based cryptographic device. That's still there. But in Rev 3, I can do a little bit more than that. I can add a single-factor cryptographic device, hardware, plus a memorized secret. I can do a multi-factor one-time password and a single-factor cryptographic. And walk through these examples here. The key point is that what they've now done is they've said to get to level 3, you must have something that's a hardware, and you must have something that's a public key, private key. And so you can have all of that in one thing, or you can have that in multiple things. So they've provided a degree of flexibility. The other thing that they've done is they've introduced an interesting concept called an additional authenticator. Previously, the only thing we had was to create this derived credential. And again, I'm going to talk a bit about what's a credential. In Rev 3, I can do something that says, hey, you authenticated with a level 3 authenticator. I'm going to allow you to bind additional authenticators into that device. And so some examples that I've done with this, this is going into your Google account, for example, and registering a new second factor device. Rev 3 also talks about some disallowed and restricted authenticators, and this is what gets into some interesting language. So there's some things that are disallowed. That email example that I showed earlier is actually a disallowed authenticator in Rev 3 because how many different devices can I get my email on? So it doesn't prove possession of a single device. VoIP is much the same issue. I've talked about knowledge-based authenticators. They moved to add in this concept of a restricted authenticator that people should assume will be disallowed in the next version. The common example is anything over the public switch telephone network. That SMS loop is a restricted authenticator. It's actually something that they're saying you should really move away from. Now, again, doing an SMS loop is better than a password by itself, but you have to do this risk assessment here. And some level of alternatives are supposed to be required. This is where, again, I can have a little bit of fun with this. This is some boilerplate out of 863. I'm going to focus on that particular passage, specifically this. It's interesting language, and it's interesting to parse it. Because NIST is saying, oh, you want to use this restricted authenticator. You're putting your users at risk. And more to the fact, you're putting your users at risk in a way that they may not be able to understand that risk and that they don't have any options. That's a bad thing. And so this is where it requires them to offer some alternatives and provide meaningful notice of what that risk looks like. Another interesting change in Rev 3. How many of us have had to change our passwords every 3 months? How many of us have had these, you must have one uppercase letter, one lowercase letter, one numeral, and something taken from the dark side of the moon. NIST 863 specifically says that's stupid. Don't do it. Actually says should not. Should not require memorized secrets to be changed arbitrarily, e.g. periodically. And I'm going to come to this in a minute. Should only force a password change when there is some evidence of compromise. Another Bruce, different last name. I love his comment. That's a link to his article. Those password rules were because we were trying to fix the user. I think we all understand. Users are broken. The wetware is often the weak link. So we need to fix the security systems. And at that original version of NIST, William Burr was one of the original authors of this. And he's got a fascinating interview that was published in the Wall Street Journal. The lead quote that's often used, much of what we did, I now regret. It was the best decision at the time. And it's interesting to see, he talks about, well, it makes sense that maybe people should change their passwords. But now as we've come to understand how these things change, no, have people use password vaults. People are terrible at generating randomness. Let the computers generate the randomness. Okay. Last thing I want to dig into is an important concept. This talks about what is a credential. And the key thing is that a credential is the thing that binds an identity to an authenticator. This is a critical component, particularly as we're talking about this. So I have defined an identity. I know what the assurance level of that is. I have defined an authenticator. I know what its assurance level is. The credential is the thing that binds it together. This matters too because the world is moving to smart cards. And a smart card uses a certificate. So a certificate is an example of a credential. And so this is an example here because part of what is in this example is here is a public key that corresponds to a private key. There is the cryptographic signature signed by this trusted authority which binds an authenticator to an identity. And so most people are inclined to think of, they're moving to this idea of we're going to use smart cards to log into Windows. And so the certificate is the credential, except when it's not. By the way, there are 8 different ways that you can use a smart card for authentication into a Windows domain. That Microsoft blog article talks a lot about it. Most of this happens through an attribute called AltSec identities. The way that a number of people do this is we will put the thumbprint of the certificate into AltSec identities. And when that happens, AltSec identities is actually the thing that binds. It becomes the credential. So again, this is an interesting thing to think about in your world. Don't assume that that certificate is the authoritative source that's binding it. I talked about this example earlier on of being able to use my smart card certificate to log into a Linux box through SSH. The binding of the authenticator to the identity is actually stored in that LDAP that's storing the SSH public keys. So let me slide into now federation assurance level. This is again where we're relying on somebody else. SAML is a common way to do this. This is evolving. And federation assurance level 1 is a bearer assertion sign. Standard SAML implementation, standard OAuth implementation. Level 2, that bearer assertion is signed by the IDP and it's encrypted to the relying party. So you're using the relying party's public key for encryption and the identity provider's private key for signing. And then level 3 adds this holder of key assertion. Now, this does get into a lot of fairly complex stuff, and not everybody supports being able to do a holder of key assertion. So this is going to be interesting, and this whole concept of federation assurance level is completely new to this version of the document. But here's the problem that they're trying to solve. This is the Wikipedia article that describes SAML. And you can see a whole bunch of bouncing back and forth. I have an identity provider, I have a service provider, I have the user's agent. Notice what is happening here. The identity provider is talking to the user's agent. The user's agent is talking to the service provider. The identity provider never talks to the service provider in a common arrangement. Yes, there is something called artifact binding where that happens. But what is this user agent? It's a browser, otherwise known as a morass of vulnerabilities and problems. So federation assurance level is all talking about how much can I trust that what the browser has relayed is in fact what's happened. A simple bearer token is exactly that. It's a bearer token. If an adversary is able to actually get into my browser and grab hold of that bearer token and push it out to the, and steal it, that's credential theft. It's the equivalent of the fire sheep sort of approach, except that all of this happens over TLS. There was a recently announced series of vulnerabilities in SAML. Many SAML libraries actually have a problem that they do not correctly canonicalize the XML in computing the signature. Duo Labs posted an interesting article about that. So Federation Assurance Level 2, because the SAML assertion is encrypted, actually protects against all of those kinds of things. So Federation assurance level is really talking about the confidence in the assertion's integrity. Was that information transmitted correctly from the identity provider to the service provider? And it also, particularly when we get into holder of key, is looking at authentication intent and making sure that somebody didn't grab that bearer token and try to replay it. They do talk about artifact binding. That's an interesting subject, but there's a lot of trade-offs. And in my environment, we can't use authentication or we can't use artifact binding because we actually bury our IDP fairly deep in the network. And so that causes a problem if we want to talk to a cloud service. You can specify the identity assurance level and the authentication assurance level as parameters in that transaction, but Federation assurance level has nothing to do with those things. So sliding into some conclusions. Like I said, I really appreciate what NIST has done. For those that don't work in the federal space, I still think this is a very valuable document because it really provides a very good framework to start looking at the whole infrastructure. What identity assurance level is really important? What's the authentication assurance level that I need for this system? What are the things that I want to look at from a Federation assurance level? Now, what they have taken out, Rev 2 had a lot of discussion about what were the threats that were at play in various different things. And the problem is that information kind of got stale fairly quickly. So they've pulled that out and they've really talked about more philosophy. And in particular, this quote is in Rev 3 in multiple different places. And it is absolutely key that the overall user experience is critical to the success of any authentication mechanism. If we make it too hard, as one of my bosses has said, users will go off the reservation. They will find ways to work around the system. As I mentioned, I work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. A number of my users are some of the most brilliant scientists in the world. And if there is a way to get around a system, they will find it. My last comment is it's a tool set. And in fact, their title for this is Digital Identity Guidelines. If you read the preamble, they say they're really talking about this in the context of government to consumer. Employer to employee is a different relationship. Your mileage may vary. So use this as a tool, not scripture. My contact information is there if you're willing to trust a QR code that somebody posts at a security conference. That will also lead you to it. There's also a short list there and my general contact info. So, questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think the greatest misconception of this revision is?
It depends. So the greatest misconceptions, I think, depend on which community that you're talking to. One of them is one of the ones that I pointed out, which is this idea that password changes on a regular basis, as a general comment, improves security. My opinion, in watching it, password changes are actually a risk event, and we're better off not doing it. I think there's a lot of challenges with people not understanding what some of the points of this are. And we've had a lot of discussion in the space about what exactly are the requirements for getting to IAL 3 and some different interpretations. So I've been on calls where there's 10 or 15 very bright people that look at the same document and come to some different conclusions. Like I said, your mileage may vary. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your CISO. But I have spent a lot of time trying to actually read through. Here were the comments that were submitted as 63.3 was being developed, and here were NIST's responses. And I've been very fortunate to be able to get some direct replies back to some questions. Additional authenticators is a concept that blows people's mind. And the concept that, and NIST, Rev 3 actually has this as a quote, that additional factor can actually be integrated into the endpoint itself. So for this thing, I have actually a YubiKey that I can take out. And people are very, very happy with that. But I have a Windows device that has what we call a virtual smart card. It's that smart card, but it's done in the trusted platform. And there's the sense that, that can't possibly be multi-factor authentication because I'm logging into the device with the device itself. No, actually it is multi-factor authentication because the real thing we care about is I'm logging into the network. I'm authenticating to Active Directory. That's what really matters in that concept. Okay? Other questions? Okay.
What kind of data was used to support the provision to collect, not just maybe anecdotal data or central data, but did they collect data on login, analyzer, anything like that?
A lot of the data that they used was coming out of the sort of usability community associated with security. So what was happening, what are the actual things that users do when we force them to change passwords? And what was the impact of that on security? And they talk about some of that particularly in some of their comments. You won't see a lot of that in the document itself, but you will see that in their responses to questions, and then in the responses to things that people wanted changed. Okay? Thank you all for your attention.